The brass key felt unnaturally heavy against my palm, its jagged edges digging into my skin. It was the only tangible thing my brother had left me, aside from a lifetime of memories where he stood as my impenetrable shield against the world. Standing in the suffocatingly still hallway of the Los Angeles apartment complex, I stared at the door. Behind it was the woman he had chosen, the woman who used to rival the California sun in her sheer, radiant vitality. Now, she was a ghost haunting her own life. When I turned the key, the lock yielded with a hollow click. The air inside hit me instantly, stale, heavy, and smelling faintly of dried, wilting flowers and unopened mail. The blinds were drawn tight, suffocating the afternoon light into thin, grayish slivers that crawled across the hardwood floor. I found her curled on the far edge of the sofa. She was entirely engulfed by an oversized gray sweater, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The sharp protrusion of her cheekbones and the dark, bruised hollows beneath her eyes made my breath hitch. She had withered. The vibrant, laughing woman who used to drag me to weekend art galleries and force me to eat vegan tacos was gone, replaced by a fragile shell that looked ready to turn to dust at the slightest touch. I stepped forward, my shoes agonizingly loud against the floorboards. I just wanted to reach out, to wrap my arms around her taut, hunched shoulders and anchor her to reality. I wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone, that we were the only pieces of him left. As my fingers brushed the rough wool of her sleeve, she recoiled violently. She shoved my hand away with a sudden, startling force. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were completely feral, burning with a cold, defensive hostility. "Get out," she rasped, her voice cracking from disuse. She didn't yell. The quietness of her command made it infinitely sharper. "I don't want you here. Looking at you, it just makes me remember. Go away." I froze, my hand suspended in the empty air between us. The rejection felt like a physical blow to the chest. A bitter, heavy misunderstanding settled in my throat. I looked at her defensive posture, the sheer venom in her stare, and my mind supplied the cruelest logic. She resented me. She hated that I was standing here, breathing, perfectly whole, while the man who tied us together was buried in the earth. I didn't leave. I stepped back, absorbing the venom in her gaze, and simply nodded. I picked up the scattered trash around the coffee table, ignoring the way she pulled her knees tighter, watching me like a cornered animal. For 30 days, we existed in a brutal, silent war of attrition. Every morning, I unlocked her door. The apartment became a battlefield of mundane chores. I scrubbed the countertops until my knuckles ached, vacuumed the carpets, and opened the windows just enough to let the ocean breeze dilute the stagnation. I cooked. I stood over the stove, meticulously chopping vegetables and simmering broths, pouring every ounce of my unresolved grief into the mechanics of survival. I would leave a ceramic bowl of soup outside her bedroom door. Hours later, I would return to find it untouched, completely cold. Sometimes, I would watch her emerge like a phantom, pick up the plate I had spent hours preparing, and scrape it directly into the garbage disposal without breaking eye contact with me. The aggressive hum of the disposal blades grinding the food into nothingness was the only conversation we had. On the 23rd day, I found her passed out on the bathroom floor, her body burning with a raging fever. I didn't hesitate. I lifted her onto the couch, cooled her skin with damp cloths, and sat with her through the night, monitoring her temperature and forcing sips of electrolyte water between her chapped lips. She never said a word when she woke, but the bowl of soup I left that evening was empty when I returned. It was the first crack in her armor, a tiny, silent surrender that kept me going through the remaining days. She was trying to break me. She offered nothing but cold remarks when she spoke at all, telling me I was wasting my time, that my presence was suffocating her. Each rejection stacked upon the last, building a towering wall of perceived resentment. I swallowed the lump of humiliation and injustice every single day. I thought she blamed me for his absence, but I refused to abandon the only family I had left. If she wanted to drown in the dark, she would have to drag me down with her. The collapse was not sudden. It was an erosion. I had been running on the fumes of sheer stubbornness. Between managing the remnants of my brother's estate, dealing with the legal paperwork, and spending every waking hour maintaining her life, I had entirely neglected my own. Sleep was a fractured, distant concept. Food was something I prepared for her, entirely forgetting to consume it myself. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The air conditioning was broken, and the apartment was stifling. I was kneeling on the floor of my brother's home office, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with his old files, ledgers, and architectural blueprints. The smell of his faint cologne lingering on the paper was a sharp knife to the ribs. I stood up to grab another stack of folders. A heavy, blinding static suddenly erupted behind my eyes. The sound of the street outside morphed into a muffled, underwater hum. My knees buckled, devoid of any strength, and the edges of my vision rapidly tunneled into blackness. I didn't even feel the impact as the floor rushed up to meet me. Consciousness returned in fragments. First, the rhythmic, synthetic beep of a heart monitor. Then, the sterile, biting smell of rubbing alcohol and bleached linens. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, a dull ache throbbing at my temple. The hospital room was quiet. I shifted slightly, and that was when I felt the weight on my right hand. I turned my head. She was sitting in a rigid plastic chair beside the bed. Her posture was entirely defeated, her shoulders hunched inward. Both of her hands were wrapped desperately around mine, gripping my fingers as if I were the only solid object in a collapsing universe. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them swollen and wet. When she realized I was awake, a choked, broken sound escaped her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The hostility utterly vanished, leaving only raw, unprotected agony. "I'm so sorry." I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry. I could only watch in stunned silence as the impenetrable fortress she had built around herself shattered completely. The truth poured out of her in a fractured, breathless confession. There was no hatred. There was no resentment toward me. She looked down at our joined hands, her tears dropping onto my skin. "He was rushing," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "He was driving back in the storm because it was my birthday. He wanted to surprise me. If I hadn't insisted on being home, if I hadn't existed, he wouldn't have been on that road." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical impact. The puzzle pieces of her cruelty violently rearranged themselves into a picture of crushing self-hatred. "I thought I was poison," she continued, her grip tightening until it almost hurt. "I thought I killed him. And then you came, looking just like him, trying to save me. I didn't deserve it. I was so terrified that my curse would drag you down too. I thought if I was cruel enough, if I pushed you away hard enough, you would leave and go live a beautiful, safe life without the burden of a murderer tying you down." I stared at her, the sheer weight of her silent suffering crushing my chest. All those weeks of coldness, the dumped food, the locked doors. It wasn't an attack. It was a twisted, desperate act of protection. She was starving herself of affection, so I wouldn't be infected by her ruin. And the company. She wept, her shoulders shaking violently. The house, the accounts. "I transferred all of his equity, everything he left behind, into your name 3 weeks ago. It was always yours. He built it for you. I was just holding it. I was just waiting for you to hate me enough to leave, so I could finally disappear." The sheer magnitude of her sacrifice, her willingness to endure complete isolation and give up every worldly security just to keep me safe, obliterated the last remnants of my misunderstanding. I pulled my hand from her grasp, only to reach up and pull her violently into my arms. She collapsed against my chest, her rigid frame finally giving way. I buried my face in her shoulder, my own tears soaking her sweater. The embrace held no softness. It was desperate, gripping, an absolute refusal to let go. "We are the only ones left," I whispered fiercely against her hair, my voice thick with absolute certainty. "His greatest wish was for us to survive. You are not poison. You are my family. We are going to carry him together." From that sterile hospital room onward, the iron gate between us was demolished. We became the architects of each other's survival. 6 months passed. The suffocating silence of the apartment was slowly replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of shared routine. She taught me how to perfectly roast coffee beans. I reminded her to water the plants on the balcony. We were 2 fractured pieces leaning against one another to stand upright. But the world outside our sanctuary was not finished testing the foundations of our bond. It began with a knock on the door that shattered our quiet Tuesday morning. Standing in the hallway was a man whose presence immediately made the air in the room turn cold. He was my brother's former business partner, a man whose polished suits never quite hid the predatory calculation in his eyes. He sat at our dining table, sliding a thick, intimidating stack of legal documents toward her. His tone was laced with a patronizing sympathy that made my stomach turn. The company is bleeding, sweetheart, he told her, tapping a manicured finger against the paperwork. Your husband left behind hidden debts. Massive ones. The creditors are circling. If you don't sign these equity forfeiture papers today, they won't just liquidate the firm. He shifted his gaze toward me, a subtle, sharp threat lacing his words. They'll go after his next of kin. They'll take her apartment, her savings, everything she has. I watched the color instantly drain from her face. The panic that seized her was visceral. Her eyes darted toward me, wide with the familiar terror of being the cause of my ruin. The instinct to sacrifice herself, to take the hit so I could remain standing, flared to life instantly. Her hand shook violently as she reached for the silver pen resting on the documents. She was ready to throw away her husband's entire legacy just to shield me from a phantom threat. Where do I sign? She asked, her voice tight, completely ignoring the blatant inconsistencies in the man's narrative. I moved before she could uncap the pen. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly over hers, pressing the pen back onto the table. The physical contact was a silent, immovable command. Stop. She looked up at me, confusion and fear battling in her eyes. I met her gaze evenly, projecting a calm I had to force into existence. I squeezed her hand once, a tactile promise that I was not going to let her fall on her sword. We aren't signing anything today, I stated, my voice echoing the cold, authoritative tone my brother used to use in boardrooms. I pulled the documents away from the man's reach. Leave the paperwork. Our legal counsel will review the ledgers by Friday. The partner's polite facade cracked, a flash of genuine anger bleeding through. You don't understand the gravity of the situation, little girl. I'm trying to save you both. We will save ourselves, I replied, opening the front door. Get out. When the door clicked shut behind him, she crumbled into one of the dining chairs, burying her face in her hands. I can't let him ruin you, she sobbed into her palms. If there's debt, I have to take it. I have to protect you. I knelt beside her chair, pulling her hands away from her face. You don't have to protect me by destroying yourself, I told her, my voice low and fierce. You stood in front of me for 6 months. Now, it's my turn to stand in front of you. The following 72 hours were a masterclass in psychological endurance. We converted the dining room into a war room. I utilized every ounce of the analytical logic my brother had instilled in me, poring over the convoluted financial spreadsheets the partner had left behind. She sat beside me, brewing endless pots of black coffee, organizing the messy files into coherent timelines. It didn't take long to find the rot. The debts were entirely fabricated, shell accounts created by the partner to funnel company profits into his personal offshore holdings. He was using our grief and her vulnerability as a weapon to steal the firm outright. We didn't just hire a lawyer. We hired a forensic accountant. The confrontation took place in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of my brother's old firm. The partner sat across the mahogany table, exuding arrogant confidence. He expected a weeping widow and a naive younger sister. Instead, I slid a black binder across the table. Wire fraud, embezzlement, and a documented attempt at extortion. I listed clinically, watching the smugness physically melt off his face as he flipped through our evidence. Beside me, she sat perfectly upright, her shoulders squared, projecting a silent, unbreakable dignity. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. The precision of the trap we had built was absolute. You will surrender your shares to the estate by 5 p.m., I told him, the coldness in my tone absolute. Or these documents go to the federal prosecutor. When we walked out of that building, the Los Angeles sun felt different. It wasn't blinding. It was illuminating. She reached out and grasped my hand as we crossed the street. There were no words exchanged, only the profound, silent recognition that we had fought the wolves back to back, and we had won. Fate, however, has a cruel sense of symmetry. Just as the dust settled on the company, the universe fractured our fragile peace again. It was a rainy Thursday. The roads in the canyon were slick with oil and water. The oncoming headlights blinded me for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The horrifying crunch of metal against concrete, the violent deployment of the airbag, the blinding flare of pain in my right leg, it all blurred into a chaotic symphony of destruction. I woke up exactly where I had woken up months prior, in a stark white hospital room. This time, my right leg was encased in a heavy plaster cast, elevated and suspended by a complex pulley system. My ribs ached with every breath. The door pushed open and she walked in. She had dropped everything. The company meetings, her own healing process, her entire life. She abandoned it all the second she got the call. She walked to the side of my bed, her face pale but her eyes entirely devoid of the panic I expected. Instead, there was an ironclad resolve. "You shattered your tibia," she informed me calmly, brushing a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. Her touch was impossibly gentle. "2 surgeries. But the doctors said you'll walk again. You just need time." I looked at the heavy cast, a wave of uselessness and frustration washing over me. "I can't run the company like this. I can't even stand up." She leaned down, her gaze locking onto mine with absolute authority. "You don't need to stand up," she said, her voice steady and anchoring. "I am going to carry you, just like you carried me." The recovery process stripped away every remaining layer of ego between us. For 12 weeks, I was entirely dependent on her. The woman who had once locked herself away from the world to starve in the dark now became my sole tether to the light. She moved a cot into my bedroom. When the pain medication wore off in the middle of the night, leaving me gasping and sweating in agony, she was there before I could even call out. She would sit on the edge of the bed, holding a cool, damp washcloth to my forehead, murmuring quiet assurances until my breathing regulated. She fed me when my hands shook too much to hold a spoon. She learned how to change my surgical dressings, her hands never shaking, never showing an ounce of disgust or fatigue. She became my physical therapist, dragging me through the excruciating exercises required to keep my muscles from atrophying. During one particularly brutal afternoon of rehabilitation, the pain in my leg flared so sharply I collapsed onto the exercise mat, crying out in raw frustration. I hit the floor with my fists, hating my own weakness. She dropped to her knees beside me. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to calm down. She simply wrapped her arms around my shoulders from behind, pressing her forehead against my back, absorbing the force of my frustration into her own steady frame. "Breathe," she instructed quietly, her presence a solid wall against my crumbling willpower. "You have every right to be angry. Be angry. But don't give up. I'm right here. I've got you." In that moment on the floor, the final, unbreakable threads of our bond were woven. We were no longer just 2 women connected by the ghost of a man we loved. We were forged in the fire of each other's lowest moments. We were sisters, defined not by blood, but by choice. The Alaskan wind was sharper than anything I had ever felt, carrying the scent of ancient ice and pure, unfiltered freedom. We stood side by side on the viewing deck of the glacier, bundled in thick parkas. My legs still held a faint ache in the freezing cold, but I stood firmly on my own 2 feet. This was my brother's lifelong dream, to see the edge of the world where the ice met the sky. She pulled her scarf down slightly, the biting wind whipping her hair across her face. The hollows in her cheeks were gone, replaced by the healthy, vibrant flesh of a woman who had fought her way back from the grave. She looked out at the vast, intimidating expanse of the glacier, and for the first time in over a year, I heard her laugh, a real, unburdened sound that echoed across the ice. She reached out and bumped her shoulder against mine. I turned to look at her, seeing the reflection of the snow in her eyes. We had navigated the darkest labyrinths of grief, misunderstanding, and corporate warfare. We had watched each other break, and we had meticulously glued the pieces back together, stronger and sharper than before. The world had tried to isolate us, to pit our traumas against one another, but we had chosen to become an impenetrable front. Later, we would fly to the warm beaches of Florida, trading the ice for the sun. We would return to Los Angeles and run the firm as equal partners, navigating boardrooms and business deals with the synchronized perfection of 2 people who knew how to cover each other's blind spots. But in that moment, standing on the edge of the frozen world, nothing else mattered. I looked at the woman beside me, my anchor, my shield, my sister. We didn't need words to acknowledge the profound weight of our journey. Her presence beside me was the only testimony required. Our story was not a fairy tale of magical rescues. It was a gritty, relentless testament to the sheer, unyielding power of women refusing to let each other fall. And as the sun hit the ice, illuminating the horizon in brilliant gold, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter what storms lay ahead, we would never face them alone. The transition from the glacial winds of Alaska to the suffocating humidity of the Florida coast was jarring. We traded the stark, blinding white of the tundra for the overwhelming, saturated blues and greens of the tropics. The air tasted heavy, thick with salt and the metallic tang of impending afternoon thunderstorms. We rented a small, unassuming beachfront house. It was supposed to be the second half of our tribute to him. He had always wanted to see the contrast between the absolute cold and the absolute warmth. But the environment brought an unforeseen trigger. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky bruised purple with terrifying speed, as Florida skies often do. She was behind the wheel of our rental SUV, navigating the slick, unfamiliar coastal highway. I sat in the passenger seat, the air conditioning blasting against my face, watching the rain violently lash against the windshield. A heavy commercial truck in the opposite lane hydroplaned. The massive tires shrieked against the asphalt, a sound that violently ripped through the cabin of our car. I watched her hands lock onto the steering wheel. Her knuckles turned entirely white, the skin stretching taut over the bone. The truck regained control and sped past us, but the damage was already done. The sharp, violent noise of the skidding tires had transported her back to the two most horrific moments of our lives: the call about his crash and the sight of my crushed car. She pulled the SUV onto the muddy shoulder of the highway, slamming the gear into park. Her breathing was entirely erratic, shallow gasps tearing from her throat. Her eyes were fixed on the rhythmic, aggressive swipe of the windshield wipers, but I knew she wasn't seeing the rain. She was seeing shattered glass and twisted metal. I didn't panic. I didn't offer empty words of comfort, knowing the sheer uselessness of telling someone in the grip of a flashback to calm down. Instead, I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached across the center console. I pressed my palm flat and firm against the center of her back, right between her shoulder blades. The pressure was deliberate, a heavy, undeniable physical anchor to the present moment. "Feel the engine," I instructed, my voice pitched low and entirely steady. "Feel the vibration under your feet. We are stopped. We are safe." She squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders rigid with tension under my hand. "I can't hear anything else," she choked out, her voice fractured. "The sound of the tires, it's so loud." "Focus on the rain," I countered, keeping my hand anchored firmly against her spine. I tapped a slow, methodical rhythm against the thick fabric of her jacket. "Listen to the water hitting the glass. Count the drops with me." We sat on the side of that desolate, rain-swept highway for 40 minutes. I maintained the firm, steady pressure on her back, acting as the physical barrier between her mind and the abyss of her trauma. Slowly, the erratic hitch in her breathing smoothed out. The rigid tension in her jaw relaxed. When she finally opened her eyes, the sheer terror had receded, replaced by a profound, exhausted clarity. She looked at me, the unspoken gratitude heavy in the humid air. I didn't pity her. I respected her deeply for fighting her way back to the surface. I simply nodded, leaned back into my seat, and waited for her to put the car back into drive when she was ready. Returning to the Los Angeles skyline meant returning to the harsh, unforgiving reality of corporate survival. The sanctuary of our shared grief was over. The world expected us to perform. Our brother's architectural firm occupied the 14th floor of a glass and steel high-rise. The air inside the boardroom always smelled of ozone from the copy machines, expensive leather, and the suffocating, heavy cologne of the old guard developers who treated us like temporary placeholders. We sat across from a major prospective client, a man in his late 50s whose patronizing smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He represented a massive commercial contract that could either secure our company's future for the next decade or bury us entirely. From the moment the meeting began, his strategy was glaringly obvious. He attempted to divide and conquer. He directed every single question, every technical inquiry, entirely to her. He maintained aggressive, uninterrupted eye contact with her, deliberately ignoring my presence at the table. He assumed, based on age and outdated industry biases, that the older widow was the fragile figurehead and I was merely an administrative assistant. He wanted to intimidate her into accepting a severely undervalued contract by isolating her. I sat perfectly still, my pen hovering over my legal pad, observing the psychological warfare. I felt a familiar flash of anger, but I clamped it down, waiting for her cue. She didn't flinch. She sat with an impeccably straight posture, her hands folded neatly over the mahogany table. As the client finished a long, condescending monologue about how we needed his guidance to navigate the complexities of the current market, she let a heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch across the room. Then, without breaking eye contact with the man, she slowly shifted her shoulders, angling her body entirely toward me. Those are valid concerns regarding the structural zoning, she said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, authoritative ice. She gestured toward me with an open palm. However, the primary architect of this expansion strategy is sitting right here. I suggest you direct your technical apprehensions to the person who designed the blueprint. The subtle shift in power was instantaneous. She hadn't just deflected a question. She had violently shattered his attempt to isolate her and forcibly elevated me to my rightful position. She threw her entire weight behind my expertise, building an impenetrable wall of solidarity right in the middle of the boardroom. The client blinked, clearly entirely derailed by the seamless, unified front. I met her eyes for a fraction of a second. The silent communication was absolute. We do not bow. I turned to the client, unrolled the blueprints, and began to dismantle his arguments with merciless, calculated precision. The victory in the boardroom, however, masked a deeper, quiet fracture that began to spiderweb between us over the handling of the new contract. Late one evening, the Los Angeles city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our apartment, the tension finally snapped. The air in the living room felt dense, smelling faintly of the bitter espresso we had been drinking to stay awake. The blueprints were scattered across the kitchen island. I wanted to leverage the new contract to completely overhaul the firm's direction, pushing into sustainable, high-risk urban development. It was aggressive, bold, and exactly what her brother would have done. She violently opposed it. It's too reckless, she argued, pacing the length of the kitchen. Her movements were tight, defensive. If the supply chain stalls, we absorb the financial impact. We could lose the entire operational budget in 6 months. If we play it safe, we stagnate, I countered, keeping my voice even, though frustration burned in my chest. We just fought off a hostile takeover. We just proved we can handle the pressure. Why are you suddenly pulling the parachute? She stopped pacing and pressed her palms flat against the marble countertop, her head bowed. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. When she finally looked up, the corporate armor was gone. Her eyes were wide, flooded with that identical, raw terror I had seen in the hospital room months ago. Because if this fails, you lose everything, she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her confession. I can survive losing the company. I survived losing him. But I cannot survive watching you lose the security he built for you. I won't let my signature be the reason you end up with nothing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a business dispute. This was the ghost of her guilt, rising from the ashes. She was still trying to be my human shield. She was terrified that her involvement in the company was inherently flawed, and she was desperately trying to lock me in a gilded cage of financial safety to protect me from her perceived failures. I walked around the kitchen island. I didn't reach for the blueprints or the financial projections. I walked directly into her space, entirely bridging the physical distance she was trying to maintain. I reached out and gripped both of her shoulders. The fabric of her blouse was cool under my hands, but the tension in her muscles was like coiled steel. Look at me, I demanded softly, refusing to let her avert her gaze. She met my eyes, the vulnerability entirely exposed. You are not a curse, and I am not glass, I told her, enunciating every word with deliberate, unyielding conviction. You stood between me and a fraudulent partner. You rebuilt my shattered leg. You are the only reason this company even exists today. Stop trying to protect me from the life we are supposed to build together. I let go of her shoulders and picked up the boldest, most aggressive blueprint from the counter. I held it up between us. If we fail together. If we lose it all, we rebuild it from the ground up, together. I set the paper down and leveled my gaze at her. I don't want a safe harbor. I want to build an empire, and I am not doing it with anyone else but you. I watched the exact moment the fear broke. The rigid, protective walls she had desperately tried to re-erect crumbled into dust. She let out a long, shaky breath, the tension completely draining from her spine. She looked at the blueprint, then back at me, a profound, unshakable trust finally settling into her features. She picked up the red pen resting on the counter and drew a sharp, decisive line across the old, conservative budget. Fine, she said, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. We build the empire. The next morning, we walked into the final negotiation with the developers. We did not argue. We did not hesitate. We executed a flawless, synchronized strategy, demanding our terms with the terrifying confidence of two women who had absolutely nothing left to fear from the world. They signed the contract without a single revision. Years have passed since the silent, suffocating war in that dark apartment. The dust motes and the untouched bowls of soup feel like a distant, monochrome dream compared to the vibrant reality we inhabit now. The firm is thriving, a towering testament to our combined resilience. But the true masterpiece of our survival is not the steel and glass we build. It is the unbreakable architecture of our bond. We still share the apartment, though it is unrecognizable from its former state. The heavy blinds are gone, replaced by sheer curtains that let the relentless California sun flood the hardwood floors. The air always smells of fresh jasmine and roasting coffee. I sit on the balcony, watching the amber hues of the Los Angeles sunset bleed into the smoggy horizon. I hear the slide of the glass door behind me, followed by the soft clink of ceramic. She steps onto the balcony and hands me a steaming mug of tea. The casual, profound intimacy of the gesture, a stark, beautiful inversion of the days she used to dump my offerings into the trash, never fails to ground me. She leans against the railing beside me, the evening breeze catching her hair. The hollows in her cheeks have long been replaced by the quiet, radiant strength of a woman who has completely conquered her own shadows. She doesn't flinch at the memories anymore. She carries them with grace. I take a sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Our journey fundamentally dismantled everything I thought I knew about strength. I used to believe strength was stoicism, a solitary endurance against the crushing weight of the world. But she taught me the truth. True strength is the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone else see your absolute worst and trusting them enough to let them pull you out of the wreckage. We are not bound by blood, nor by the man we both loved and lost. We are bound by the countless, invisible threads of mutual salvation. We patched each other's bullet holes. We became the compass and the anchor for one another in a world that tried to drown us both. She turns her head, catching me staring. A quiet, knowing smile touches her lips. There is no need for grand declarations or dramatic confessions of loyalty. The profound, unwavering truth exists in the steady rhythm of our shared life. The world will undoubtedly throw more storms our way. Markets will crash, tragedies will strike, and the ground beneath our feet may fracture again. But as I look at the woman standing beside me, my partner, my chosen family, my fiercest protector, I feel absolutely invincible. Because I know, with the absolute certainty of the sun rising tomorrow, that as long as we stand together, the sky can fall all at once. We will simply hold it up,